You're listening to Sharky on sharkgoeschomp. Tonight, the first person to correctly find how all three of these stories are connected and send me an email will win a shout out on my next video. And now, we have 3 true April Fool's stories from Letsnotmeet. So I guess I was the stalker? You judge. Submitted by scodrak. Some years ago, I nipped to local shops. I parked my car and was about to get out when an unmarked white van pulled up alongside from the opposite direction. The driver put his window down and motioned for me to do the same. Assuming he wanted directions, I did so. He then pulled out a camera and took a picture of me. Confused, I asked him why he had done so. He said, "I know you're following me, and I'm going to take a picture of you every day to prove it." Confused as hell, I protested. I had never seen him before, and I was not following him. He told me that there was no use denying it, and that he saw me everywhere, and he was going to keep taking pictures of me to prove it. I insisted I wasn't, but then just shrugged and told him whatever, and he drove off. I was so confused. Told my family when I got home, and we discussed it, but couldn't come up with anything other than perhaps just mistaken identity. Then I remembered it was April 1st, and he decided it must have been just an April Fool's joke. We had a laugh about it, and I mentioned it to some friends over the next couple weeks, who are all naturally found it hilarious, and came up with various wild theories. All except one friend, who was genuinely concerned. He was usually paranoid about being watched anyway. His father had been the leader of some communist party, and he himself was well known in various circles, and thought that the government was keeping tabs on him. I think he's just paranoid, but anyway. A couple weeks passed. Then I saw the same van again, not far from my house. The driver saw me and just accelerated away. I was briefly tempted to follow, but resisted. Another week went by. Then I was just pulling away from my house when the white van went past. I was in front of me going down the road. I thought, I hope that was as far as I got before its brake lights went on, and it slammed to a stop in front of me, blocking the road. The same guy got out and came around to my window. I was a little scared, but also kind of hoping I could solve this mystery. I got my window down, and the first thing he said angrily was, "Stop following me!" I started to protest, but then realized it was pointless, as he was in front of me, so I kind of was. Although not intentionally, of course. He went on, "I know you're following me, and I want you to know that you can stop now, because I know you are, and it's no point. You tell your bosses at HMRC to leave me alone." At this point, it dawned on me he thought I worked for the Inland Revenue. That's right. I told him that I didn't, that I wasn't following him. He looked skeptically at his van and then back at me right behind him, and that if he kept harassing me, I would speak to the police. He told me again to leave him alone, got back in his van, and drove away. Unfortunately, there were no turnings down the road, and I was going the same way, so, of course, I was about to follow him again. Since this happened so close to my home, I was concerned he had seen where I lived, and that my family could be in some sort of danger, and so decided to speak to the police. So while I was driving down after him, I took a note of his plate and called the police. I explained what was happening to an increasingly incredulous operator. She said, "So he's following you at the moment, sir?" I responded a little uncomfortably, No, technically I'm following him." "Well, why are you following him, sir?" Well, I'm not. I mean, I am, but only because he's in front of me." At this point, she started laughing. A lot. She said, "Hang on." She called me back from another number, so it wasn't typing up on that line. She did so, and had me go through the whole story again. By the time I finished, she was laughing so hard she could barely speak. She said it was the funniest story she had ever heard. Well, she advised me to come to the local police station and tell my story there. They could get an officer to speak to the guy and let him know I wasn't following him and wasn't working for the IR. I did so. They laughed a lot there too and said technically he hadn't done anything wrong and technically the third time I was following him. So I left it. But I determined if I saw the guy again, I would follow him. If he was going to be paranoid anyway, well, I might as well have some fun with it. Sadly, I didn't see him again for about 8 years. The last year I was driving and there was a white van in front of me, behaving erratically. It kept putting its brakes on sharply and swerving to the edge of the road as if it was going to stop, but then swerving out again. It was making me nervous, so I decided to overtake it. I did so, and as I looked in my rearview mirror, guess who I saw getting out of the van in terms of the middle of the road and shaking his fist after me? Well, the thing is, I was in a different car all those years before. He must have recognized me in his mirror or somehow and thought I had started following him again. Well, never seen him again since, but I always hope to. I really do want to stalk him now. Man stalked an autistic high school girl. Submitted by KymmaRaven. To understand some of what happened in this story, I have to give a small amount of backstory. I am a female college student, only 5 feet and 3 inches tall, the same height I've been since middle school, and 112 pounds at my heaviest. I was 17 years old when this occurred, and I am 19 now. However, I always seem to look younger than I am. Most people think I'm 14 or 15. Though I had never been creeped on before this incident, it has been pointed out to me before that my small build, young age, and even younger appearance makes me look like a victim. One last thing that you readers must understand about me is that I, at a very young age, was diagnosed with PDD-NOS, an autism spectrum disorder. Among my symptoms are struggling to read facial expressions, tones of voice, and body language, facial blindness, meaning I struggle to remember faces, and some hypersensitivities to sound. The latter symptom doesn't normally bother me terribly much, but I do like to keep headphones on or earbuds in whenever I can to just block out sounds other than the music. The incident in question began barely a few weeks into the beginning of my senior year of high school. I had a 0 period, so every day I would have to be at school and in my class by 7 in the morning. The catch was that I had to walk, as my mother was the only one with a car and never had time to drive me or my 2 sisters or I to school. I would usually leave the house by 6:30 at the latest, and I always went alone, since my sisters didn't have a 0 period like I did. And being that it was autumn, it was very dark in the mornings, even in a relatively safe, though rather large, town, such as the one I lived in. This was a recipe for trouble. Every morning, on my way to school, I would have to walk past a small set of houses beside an Arco gas station. The middle of the 3 houses was the home of a Hispanic, mustached man who would always sit on his porch in the morning and watch me walk by. Even when I chose to walk across the street from him, I'm a terrible judge of age, but believe he may have been somewhere in his 50s. Well, regardless of his age, I always felt that he had no business watching me every morning, and unfortunately, it wasn't just in the morning that he watched me. Every afternoon, while I walked home, he would again sit on his porch and watch. He watched other kids as well, but his gaze always seemed to pick me out, even in the thick crowd. It creeped me out, but not enough to warrant me telling my mother or grandmother, whom I call Nana. Perhaps because of my autism, I somehow wound up just believing that his behavior might be not that strange. I was, after all, aware of the fact that people reading was not a skill of mine, so I just tried to ignore it. This continued on for months, with nothing of great importance occurring. I walked and he watched, and that was it. Until this is around early January. One day, I was walking to school in the early morning again. Some jerks in my neighborhood had begun popping off fireworks in spite of the early hour, and the fact that this New Year's holiday was in the past. I didn't like the loud popping noises, so I had to put my headphones on and tune up a flute song. The sound of the wooden flute soothed me, and I turned the volume up loud enough that I could drown out the fireworks a bit without deafening myself. Because of the loud music, I didn't hear the creeper man when he, for the first time ever, tried to speak to me as I walked past. I don't know if this angered him or not, but it did prompt him to walk over and lay a hand on my shoulder. Since another of my symptoms is an aversion to being touched, save for under circumstances with certain people, I immediately recoiled from the man. The swift movement, combined with the way I jumped, was enough to cause my headphones to slip off my head and around my neck. Almost as soon as they did so, I turned to the man, and he, for whatever reason, smiled at me. "I spoke to you, sweetheart. Guess you didn't hear me." There was a small pause, and he asked, "What are you listening to?" I didn't say a word back to him for several reasons. One, I was startled. Two, I was well aware of the concept of stranger danger, and it didn't like speaking to new people. Anyway. Three, I didn't think the answer to his question was any of his business. Fourth and finally, I didn't want to waste my time and end up being late for school. So instead of replying, I simply turned and resumed walking to school. Nothing further happened that day apart from the man's usual staring, and I didn't tell my mom or Nana. However, my ordeal wasn't through yet. The events of that day ushered a new period of creepiness, with him now trying to speak to me every single time I passed his house, even when there were well over 100 other people around. But because I could never really read him, I could never quite tell if he was just trying to be overly friendly, or if he was genuinely being a creeper. It bothered me, but I still didn't tell anyone, and things only escalated from there. Around March, I was genuinely stalked for the first time. I walked past the man's house one morning, as I always had to do when walking to school, and he suddenly got off of his plastic chair, stepped off of his porch, and walked beside me. He stayed there the whole way, only leaving when I reached the school. This, of course, freaked me out, but one aspect of it didn't. There is only one high school in the whole town, large enough town that it was, so I figured he would know my school either way. Still, him following me did finally scare me enough to consider speaking about it, but of course, I was a fool and didn't. Instead, I did something I have learned to do over the years to express myself, something I still struggle with. I wrote. By the end of May, I had filled a good couple of pages with small snippets of journal entries where I vented about my encounters with the man. During that time, he had accompanied me to school nearly every other day and had put his hand on my shoulders and arms multiple times. He always seemed to enjoy the way I jumped, and would smile every time I would try to glare. Then, about a week into April, he got creepier. He walked with me to school again, despite my attempts to get him to leave, and talked the whole way. At one point, he told me quite suddenly, "You're special, sweetheart, I can tell. My niece is a lot like you. She's special too. I like special girls." I had no idea what he really meant by that last comment, but something about it freaked me out, just enough to prompt me to sprint the rest of the way to school, textbook-laden backpack in tow. I was no track star, but I was fast enough to lose him. He made chase, but thankfully stopped once I was within the school's gates. After that, he simply walked away. Still, my journal entry for the day was quite creepy in comparison to the rest. This is where my wonderful Nana comes in. My Nana is a hard-working woman to live with for many reasons. One of those reasons being that she was still a very nosy woman. Barely 3 or 4 days after the man made that special girls comment to me, my Nana happened upon my nondescript spiral notebook journal sitting on my desk in my room, which one had to pass through to get to the backyard. Having never seen it before, she promptly picked it up, opened it, and read its contents. Its secrets revealed. My normally grouchy, but also very protective and loving grandmother freaked out, called my mom, and the two of them picked me up after school that day. One would think that this sort of incident would have been reported to the local police, right? Well, that didn't happen. The reason for this is the fact that the cops in that town generally don't care about doing their duties unless they think weapons are involved in the crimes taking place, which often leads me to wonder how the town stays as generally safe as it does. A prime example of their lack of care was when my sister was stalked and harassed by some large teenage boys on the way home from school once. The police said she had probably somehow provoked them, and that nothing could be done. My mom never really forgave the local cops for that. There was only around 10 of them, nor did she ever regain their trust in them. As such, the only change that occurred was that she and my Nana helped me work out a new route to get to me from school, as I struggled with learning streets and the like, and my Nana promised to pick me up in the afternoons whenever she could. Nothing else really happened after that. I avoided the man successfully, and life went on. The only other thing relating to this incident that ever came up was a rumor. That rumor was, supposedly, that the man who had stalked me to and from school was a known pedophile. I never learned if that was true, and I moved away from that town with my whole family that August. The chances of me ever seeing that man again are slim, and I am very glad. Edit. I mentioned at the top of this post that I struggle with facial blindness, but forgot to explain why this is relevant. The reason why it is important into the story is because even pretending that the cops had cared about the stalker man, I likely would not have been able to tell them anything more than what house he lived in and that he had a mustache. And of course, that may have not have helped if there were other mustached men living with him. So, needless to say, there probably still would not have been much of anything done by the police in that case. My coworker may soon be a victim of human trafficking. Submitted by Ka-chan1. Updated. Hi, I'm new to this site, and I'm not sure if this is allowed or in the category. If so, feel free to remove it. Anyways, I am currently starting to fear for my coworker's life. Here's the story. My coworker, I will call her Jane, is 33 years old, a virgin, and a very devout Christian. Her family is very strict and very religious. I'm not bashing on the religion in any way. I was raised a Christian myself. These people, though, they just seem to take their beliefs to a new extreme. Think of them as the Flanders from The Simpsons. I mentioned that Jane is a virgin because she was honestly never even had a boyfriend before. She's been on a few dating websites as of late, but she's usually very strict when it comes to the types of guys she would date. She can be a bit of a stuck-up, which has gained her very little popularity. She recently meets a guy on OkCupid. Let's call him Miguel. Miguel claims to live in a bigger city than ours, an hour away. We are in the middle of nowhere in Kansas, and that he is 35 years old. Also claims to be a virgin and takes an interest in Jane. They chat for a while, and she's very excited. Once they establish a fondness for each other, he claims that he has a $250,000 in savings and a job at Cessna that pays $65 an hour. He has a very nice apartment and 2 cars. one of which is a '69 Dodge Charger. Sounds too good to be true, right? Well, we agree. Everyone but her. They agreed to meet for a first date, and he says he'll drive down to see her. While driving down here, he claims to get into an accident on the interstate and is left hospitalized. Jane is devastated. The rest of us, who she was telling this to, all just assumed that he was lying to her and that this was his way of getting out of the date and her finding out that he was scum. We didn't think there would be any more communication afterwards. We were wrong. They continued talking, and shortly after getting out of the hospital, he claimed he was hit by a car crossing the street. His life apparently took a turn for the worst, as he claimed he was laid off from Cessna. His apartment was burglarized, and all of his money and all of his other cars were seized by the IRS due to a misunderstanding in his taxes from a few years back. Completely believable stories, right? Much to our dismay, Jane decides she doesn't care about these things, and she's willing to continue talking to the man. He soon starts calling her daily and coming over once a week to visit her at work. At this point, we get to meet this guy, and he comes off as your typical loser with a beer belly who lays around on the couch all day, yelling at his woman to bring him a beer. Despite all of the money he claims to have, he wears clothes that are way too big for him, usually sweatpants and flip-flops. This earned him the nickname Flip-Flops amongst us at work. He has problems making eye contact with people when he talks to them, and has the creepiest smile. We know right away that he doesn't seem very trustworthy. 3 weeks into their relationship, he shows up out of work and proposes to Jane. She gladly agrees, as we all shake our heads in disbelief. He tells us he got a new job working for Microsoft down in his city. Now, we did our research. There's no Microsoft jobs over there, unless you're working and selling products at Best Buy. And he tells her that he's now seeing a therapist for his anger and jealousy issues. Many red flags are going off in our heads at this point. But Jane doesn't seem to mind any of it. He moves down here to be with her, after claiming that his family disowned him for wanting to marry a Christian. He claims they're all devout Catholics, and that's the reason why she'll never get to meet them. As if this isn't ridiculous and over the top enough, things start to get creepier from here. He tells us that he has a new job for $25 an hour as the head engineer at Exide Manufacturing. The head of HR at Exide is actually a relative of a friend of ours, so we asked her about this. They never heard of this man, and the position he claims he has doesn't even exist. We tried to tell Jane about it, but she brushes all of us off, our comments off, and claims that we are thinking too much about it, and we're just jealous. He starts picking her up and dropping her off from work every single day, as well as picking her up from all of her lunches. She still believes he has a full-time job, and that he's only doing this because of how much he loves her. We start to feel that he's just wanting to know where she is at all times. He asked the maintenance man at our work, after their first meeting, to be the best man at his wedding. This doesn't strike Jane as odd, because apparently Miguel is just untrusting of most people and has no friends of his own. They all want him for his money. Her parents loan him their spare van, so he can use that to drive from now on. To our shock, her parents are already buying baby clothes and supplies for the couple. They are completely won over by this man. I think they're just blinded by the fact that their daughter finally has someone and will give them grandkids, which is a really sad thought. By this point, we've noticed her personality growing slightly more stressed and depressed as time goes on. Now, if you read up to this point, you're probably thinking, oh, she's just another dumb girl who picked up a sleazeball guy who's milking her for all she's worth. And you're definitely not wrong. We all thought the same thing. Until she one day dropped this little bomb on us. He has just recently told her that he used to be a special ops in the military, the Air Force to be exact, and that they decided they want him to work for them again. They'll pay him $75,000 for working 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months. The story always changes, something she doesn't find suspicious at all. Testing military equipment that's too dangerous and could be life-threatening. He agrees to the work, and we all think he's copping out of the relationship. She then tells us that if she wishes to remain in contact with him, they'll have to get married as soon as possible, and she'll have to be prepared to move away with him. She explains that the military has been calling her and making stops at their house to explain to her that she'll have to marry him immediately, and that she needs to be prepared to move to an undisclosed location at any given moment. From that location, she's not allowed to make any contact with her friends or family, since all that is going on is top secret, and she has to prove that she can be trusted. Obviously, all of us are now alarmed. Everyone but her and her family. They're all delighted that she's with a military man, and are proud that she gets to be some part of something big. The rest of us, the sane people, are trying to figure out what on earth he can be plotting. Is she going to be hijacked into human trafficking? Is he going to murder her? One of our coworkers had just called the human trafficking hotline, and they think that this sounds definitely like something they've seen before. Unfortunately, they can't do anything about it until he actually makes a move and takes her. We're looking into contacting our local police to see if there's anything that can be done about this before she gets the phone call that tells her they have to make their move. This is also crazy. We don't know really what to expect or just what danger she's really in. Any thoughts would be appreciated, and thank you for reading. Update. The first time I met Miguel, it was on a freight day at work. We all work in a retail store. Jane and the rest of her department had just finished their freight, and they were allowed to go home for the day. I grumbled as I worked in the department next to them and had to finish my freight by myself. I worked right next to them and right next to the time clock. And so as I saw Jane clock out, about 10 minutes later, a guy shows up in sweatpants and flip-flops. He smiles creepily at me as he wanders around her department. I continue putting up my freight. He walks up to me and hands me a Pepsi. "Can you give this to Jane, please?" Sorry, dude. She just clocked out for the day." "What?" His face dropped as he darted to the front door. I shrugged it off and continued working. A few minutes later, he comes back slightly flustered. "Her car is still there. She's still here." I gave him a funny look and stated that I saw her clock out. He stormed off again. A few minutes later, he returns furious. "Her car is out there. Where is she?" I was a bit alarmed. Jane is pretty obese, so I thought to myself she was probably taking her that long to get across the store. "Do I need to get a manager on you? Where is Jane?" Fortunately for me, my boyfriend showed up at that time. He expected me to get off the same time as the rest of my coworkers, so he came in trying to find me. "Did you see Jane? I just saw her in the parking lot." Flip-Flop stormed out as my boyfriend and I gave each other a what the fuck looks. The next morning, Miguel showed up at work and proposed to Jane in our stock room as we were unpacking boxes. My boyfriend laughed when I told him this. He wasn't surprised that Jane was dating that Neanderthal. Looking back on it now, I think that the fact that Jane could slip through this guy's grasp and actually do something unnoticed by him freaked him out. He didn't have as much control as he wanted. That might have been instigated his proposal, making him want to make sure he had complete control over our haul, which is a terrifying thought. Alright guys, boy, was this unexpected for me. As some of you in the comments have seen, I initially tried posting this over a month ago. It, however, kept getting caught in the algorithm of a bot in this forum, and was flagged and immediately taken down. No matter how many times I edited it, apparently it was a wall of text. I finally got approved a few days ago, and that's why it's up here for you to see now. As you can imagine, a lot has happened over the months, and that's why I'm here to let you all know what has happened since. To those who want the short answer, She is fine now, and the situation is nearly completely resolved. But for the long answer, keep reading. To answer a few questions, I'll start with, to those of you who guessed Wichita, Kansas, you are mostly correct. Wichita is the city where he's from. Geez, you guys are good. Why not hire a PI? Well, quite frankly, I don't have that kind of money for that. Well, why don't you and your coworkers all pitch in to get one? Honestly, the majority of my coworkers really don't like Jane. And that's putting it nicely. I know this will sound cruel, but most of them were just counting down to the days they didn't have to see her anymore. She's always been in a bit of a bad habit of rubbing people the wrong way. Is she a naive girl? Yeah. She's stupid? Also yes. Ever since I met her, she's always insisted on being the first to give relationship advice to me and many others, despite having no experience of her own. She's actually the first to throw in her opinion and give advice on most subjects, usually on stuff that she only thinks she knows everything about. She comes off as a know-it-all and is very arrogant. Having done missionary trips in Africa before, she assumes she's seen the worst of humanity, and she's more than knowledgeable on the evils of the world. She also likes to butt into business of everyone, whether she's welcome to or not. And a few coworkers have tried setting her up on dates before, and when she comes back from them, she's usually furious and gives a lecture on, how dare you think he was good enough for me? Well, I would also like to state that this is not a direct result of her faith and religion, so you guys can stop throwing that as an excuse. It does play a part of it, but most of it is the fault of her own personality, I would say. I'm a Christian also. I was also raised a very sheltered life. I was homeschooled all throughout high school, and everyone I knew was from our church. I didn't have my first date until I was 20, and he became my first boyfriend. He's an agnostic metalhead, and my parents insisted he go to church with us before he could be approved. He showed up in trip pants, spikes, and studs, and a shirt that boldly read, "Fuck." He was nothing but kind to the congregation, and that I had the type of intervention with me the next day to make us break up. We are still together to this day, and our 7-year anniversary is this Halloween. I'm very capable of making my own decisions, and my number one rule is to not be an asshole. If my religion calls me to be an asshole, I tell it to fuck off. I never try to force it on anyone. My beliefs are for me and me alone. I understand common sense and reasoning, and though I've been through hardships, my life is pretty decent. So no, I will not take Jane's religion or sheltered life as an excuse for her ignorance and lack of common sense. Sorry for talking about me, I was just trying to prove a point there. Now, with these bits of info, I will continue on to the story. Around the same time, the story was originally posted, I think the same weekend. It turns out that Jane and Miguel had had a secret wedding ceremony at her church and were now married. Yes, there was a certificate and everything, full-blown legally binding marriage. None of his friends or family were present, only Jane's family and their pastor. She hid it from the rest of us for about a week. During these days of us being in the dark, we noticed a lot of mood shifts with her. One day, she would come in beaming and happy. The world was perfect for her. The next day, we could see the stress and tell something was wrong. A few of us noted at this time that both Jane and Miguel's Facebook accounts had been deleted. He had recently made an account, no pictures of him, just pictures of his nice cars. He rarely used it, and all of his family on the account looked nothing like him. Some of you noticed in the comments that I mentioned him being blondish-haired, blue-eyed, and light though dirty-looking skin. He claims he's Spanish, but all of his family are very distinctively Mexican-looking. We were afraid that he wasn't wanting her, usually over-talkative self, to give too much info about their situation, movements, and whereabouts when he kidnapped her. She confided in a coworker that he had a lot of outbursts, and though he hadn't been violent, he had suddenly become a different person. We tried warning her that he was dangerous, but she assured us that we were just insecure from having been cheated on by so many of our past relationships, and that it was nothing. It was sad to say that she was definitely in an abusive relationship. The saddest part is seeing a situation like this and knowing that can only help themselves at this point was her, when they refused to listen to everyone else. Jane also had a pet cat that she had for nearly 8 years to this point. Miguel was always getting angry at the cat, accusing Jane of loving it more than him, etc. Her cat likes to paw at its food bowl when you pour food into it, and one day he was trying to feed it as she playfully pawed. He went into a rage, stating that the cat was trying to attack him, and as punishment, it should go without food. For days, when Jane would come home from work, she would notice her cat getting more depressed and would cry a lot more. He would assure Jane that the cat is fine. I fed it twice today. Don't feed it or it'll get fat. He was trying to starve and probably abusing the poor cat, and she didn't see this as a sign to leave this asshole. Shortly after these incidents, Jane wound up incredibly sick and had to get rushed to the ER. She had a high fever, but that is the extent that she told us at work. She didn't return for 3 days. We were terrified that he had tried to poison her or something to get rid of her. She didn't find it strange at all that he wasn't at work for the days she was sick at home. It was this time that word made it to our work that they had been married. She came back to work, seemed to be fine. Around this time, Miguel got a phone call from the military, stating that he had to report to Fort Scott for top secret weapons testing. And shortly after this, they would have to prepare for their big move. I dare you to look up Fort Scott, Kansas, and see if that seems like the kind of place that would do super dangerous top secret military weapons testing. I couldn't begin to tell you how many lies he told that could be easily disproven by a simple Google search. She never questioned him in any of this. Unfortunately for him, the family van of hers that he had been driving had broken down on his way to the test site, and her father had to come bring him home. By pure luck, the military called afterwards and told him that the equipment he was testing had exploded and killed a few men. He was so lucky to not have turned up that day. They changed his plans, and his next top secret mission would be next April. And it would be, then after that, would be the big move. With this said, I would like to point out that I do get along with Jane. I do understand some of where she's coming from, and I don't blame the rest of my coworkers one bit for not liking her. A few of us still agree, though, that as annoying as she can be, and despite how stupid she's being, she still doesn't deserve to be murdered or trafficked or whatever would happen to her. So for those of us that cared, we were glad when we at least had until April to figure out what we could do. To continue from here, I'll explain that before they were married, Jane was surprisingly good at keeping to her beliefs. Miguel had to live with another man from Jane's church and not with her, as to keep their marriage bed sacred and not to be tempted. Miguel made it abundantly clear to Jane that he hated these arrangements and would try to start fights whenever it was clear that he was going to get laid at any time soon. A week or so after the van broke down, a letter arrived at the house of the man Miguel had been staying with. It was inquiring about why he had missed the court date for giving away his parental rights back to his wife. Fortunately, this man from the church actually had common sense, so he met up with one of Jane's sisters to discuss what to do. Despite all of the family fully loving and supporting the couple, one of her sisters was actually hesitant and showed some doubts. There's a sign of intelligent life after all. Jane's sister used this information to find Miguel's wife on Facebook and talk to her, while the churchman ran a $30 background check on Miguel. A free background check had been run on him before, but nothing suspicious turned up. So, surprisingly, this one also turned up nothing. He had to shell out $200 for a real background check that safely showed him how much of what Miguel had said about himself was complete bull. Miguel had been married twice up to this point. He had 4 children with his first wife, and they both had given up custody of the kids, who were now living with Miguel's parents. the real reason that Jane was never going to meet his family. He had one kid with his most recent wife, and they had just gotten divorced. Their divorce was finalized a few days before Miguel and Jane's wedding. Sadly, this is all the information that we coworkers were able to find out that turned up in the background check. No one else had told us anything. Jane's sister printed out copies of the marriage certificates, and they got the church together to show them to Jane. They were all able to convince her that Miguel was a lying dirtbag and helped kick him out of the house. He denied all of it until he was hauled away to a psych ward for suicide watch that night. He was released a few days later after proving himself sane. Jane issued a no-contact order and has cut off all communication with him as she proceeds to get an annulment. Jane was devastated for about a week, but she's mostly over it now. It's almost as though she was only really in love with the thought of this man's money and valor, and not him himself. And the hardest part of the situation was dealing with a blow to her ego, knowing how stupid she had been. Sadly, this didn't last very long, as she now boldly tells everyone the tale of how strong she is for getting through all of this and how brave she was. Yeah, she assures everyone that Miguel was a master con artist and he was able to fool everyone. Her family and church back her up in all of these claims, seeing as they were all fooled too. To this day, I don't think she really learned anything of value from the situation, just that she likes having everyone pat her on the back and tell her how brave she is. I apologize for making y'all lose your faith in humanity. I assure you mine is now gone too. For anyone still claiming this story is fake, I tell you one thing. I believe in strong female heroines. This story goes against everything I've held dear to my beliefs. I would never make this up, because I wouldn't want people to think anyone was capable of being this dumb. I apologize to anyone who was hoping for a more scary outcome, but this is just how it all went down. To try to answer or not answer a few more questions, I'll just discuss a bit more on this subject. The only thing that Jane and her church really care about is that Miguel had lied about being married. To this day, I can't find out what plans they had once disappeared in April. She is still holding no contact with them, and so I cannot find out this information. Jane's just too distraught over the fact that he wasn't the 35-year-old virgin of her dreams to care about any danger that she had been in. So, I'm unsure if it will ever be answered if this man is a murderer or a human trafficker or whatever. All we know is that he is definitely a lazy bum, a deadbeat dad, and an abusive asshole. And stupid. Very, very stupid. We also believe that he genuinely believes all of his lies, since he was so insistent on all of them being true up until court time, as far as we can see. So definitely thinking some kind of mental problems in there. I haven't heard on the Dirty John podcast before, but I'll definitely make time to listen. It does sound interesting. Maybe I can have her listen too and see if she actually learned something from all of this. Now, purely for your amusement, I will compile a list of some of the lies he told us that she believed wholeheartedly that haven't been mentioned. He's a black belt in many martial arts, which helped to get him his super high ranks in the military, etc. He offered to try teaching her karate once, but she hurt herself, and at the very start, and no attempts were made since. He's also a world championship gamer, Halo being his top game. He said he is in many games, but I don't remember the list she rattled on. He's won many competitions as a result. He worked in the development in a few of the other Halo games, and has many ties to Microsoft, hence why he's got a job there so easily before. At one point, Jane did see in the mail from him letter about owning a child support. Upon questioning him, he assured her that he was a virgin and had previously adopted the child of a former girlfriend of his. He loved the child dearly, and he needed a father figure. We had a festival in town in the summertime, and he was offered over $200 a day to help set up for it. Other coworkers worked to help this festival, It was a volunteer event, and no one working at it ever heard of the man. She came home one day and found him not working at the festival. He said he had to leave because he had gotten heat stroke, and she rushed him to the ER where they stayed for hours because no matter how much they tried, no signs of heat stroke were found. She spent days nursing him back to health as he was bedridden. I think it was the '69 Dodge Charger he claimed that he had at the beginning of the story that was involved in the car accident he also had at the beginning. She had to make a sudden trip back to home in Wichita one day, and he said that he was picking up the Charger from the impound lot. Jane was excited. She wanted to fix it up and couldn't wait to show it off and drive it around. Later that same day, he called and said it was too damaged, so he had to scrap it for parts, and the money had to go to the fee for holding it. Jane was crushed. About a month later, when I saw him driving around in her family's car, I mentioned that he no longer had any vehicle of his own. The IRS would have to give him back one of his cars. Suddenly, it turned out that the Charger wasn't scrapped at all. It was actually being redone in Jane's favorite colors and was going to be a wedding gift to her. Oh, happy day! Eventually, he actually got a part-time job in a factory in town after lying for days about his excite job that didn't exist, and told Jane that he was offered $45 an hour as their head engineer, where he would be head of maintenance. Coincidentally, that position already belonged to the husband of another coworker, hooray for small towns, and he certainly doesn't make $45 an hour, closer to $20. She didn't want to burst Jane's bubble, so she was never confronted about it. The 3 days she was sick from home started the same day he was starting his new job at this factory. When she asked why he was home, he stated that he went to work and they told him that they didn't have any of his contact information to tell him that he wasn't starting that day. But because this was all their fault, he was allowed to clock in and go home, so that he wasn't losing any money. Edit. Upon talking to Jane yesterday, she now fancies herself an expert in the early signs of an abusive relationship and is wanting to write a book on the subject. I think it's a great idea. There aren't really any books out there on abusive relationships, and I would love to be the voice of it, she says. Being a writer, I cringe at the very thought. I apologize if I sound bitter. I might just be more disgusted than bitter, but meh. This is Sharky with sharkgoeschomp. Remember, the first person to correctly find how all 3 of these stories are connected and send me an email will win a shout-out on my next video. Please subscribe for more stories, and you can send me your stories at stories4sharky@gmail.com. Have a good night.